Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Library. Tonight, we are drifting into the fascinating realm of human behavior, where every gesture, every thought, every decision reveals something profound about who we are. The mind is not a simple machine, following predictable rules. It is a living tapestry, woven from millions of years of evolution, shaped by invisible forces we rarely notice, but that guide us through every moment of our lives. From the way you smile when nervous, to the decisions you make without thinking, from the connections you form with strangers, to the memories that haunt you decades later, human behavior is both beautifully complex and surprisingly predictable. Tonight, we will explore the hidden patterns that make us human, the biases that shape our choices, the emotions that color our memories, the social forces that bind us together. These are not just abstract concepts. They are the living architecture of your daily experience, the quiet machinery humming beneath every conversation, every relationship, every moment of joy or sorrow. If you enjoy these quiet journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, just breathe. Let the night sink around you and allow your mind to settle. Let's begin. Your brain makes most decisions before you're aware of them. When you reach for a glass of water or decide to turn left instead of right, you feel like you're making a conscious choice. But research reveals something astonishing. Your brain has already committed to the action several seconds before you become aware of wanting to do it. Neuroscientists discovered this by monitoring brain activity while people made simple decisions. The patterns of neural firing predicted choices up to 10 seconds before participants reported any conscious intention. This doesn't mean free will is an illusion, but it does suggest that much of what we call decision-making happens in regions of the brain we cannot directly access. Your conscious mind is more like a narrator, telling you the story of what you're doing, rather than the author writing it in real time. The brain processes thousands of signals every second, weighing options, comparing outcomes, and initiating actions, all beneath the surface of awareness. By the time you feel the urge to act, countless neural calculations have already been completed. This automatic processing is not a flaw, but a feature, an evolutionary gift that allows you to navigate complex environments without drowning in deliberation. Imagine if you had to consciously control every muscle movement, every breath, every heartbeat. You would be paralyzed by the sheer volume of decisions. Instead, your brain delegates most tasks to unconscious systems that operate with stunning efficiency. This is why experts in any field, from chess to surgery to music, seem to act on instinct. Their years of practice have encoded patterns so deeply that decisions emerge fully formed, bypassing the slow machinery of conscious thought. The feeling of intention that follows is simply your consciousness catching up, creating the comforting illusion that you were in control all along. Emotions are encoded more deeply than facts. If someone tells you a story, you might forget the details within days. But if that story made you cry, made you laugh, or filled you with rage, you'll remember it for years. This is because emotions fundamentally change how memories are stored. When you experience something emotionally charged, your amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain, becomes highly active. It acts like a highlighter, marking certain experiences as important and worthy of long-term storage. The amygdala sends signals to the hippocampus, the brain's memory center, essentially saying, "This matters, remember this." As a result, emotional memories are consolidated more strongly and become more resistant to forgetting. This process served our ancestors well. Remembering the location of a predator attack or the face of a trustworthy ally could mean the difference between survival and death. Even today, you can probably recall exactly where you were during emotionally significant events. A first kiss, a moment of loss, a triumph that made your heart soar. These memories remain vivid, not because you rehearsed them consciously, but because your brain chemically stamped them as significant at the moment they occurred. The downside is that traumatic memories can become so deeply encoded that they intrude unbidden, replaying in vivid detail years after the event. This is the mechanism behind conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, where the emotional weight of a memory overwhelms the brain's ability to file it away safely. The same system that helps you remember moments of joy can trap you in moments of pain. Yet this bias toward emotional memory also explains why we treasure certain experiences, why a song can transport you instantly back to a specific moment, why the smell of rain might remind you of childhood. Emotions don't just color our memories, they are the glue that holds them together across the span of a lifetime. You mirror the people around you without realizing it. Sit across from someone in a cafe and watch what happens when they cross their arms or take a sip of coffee. Chances are, within moments, you'll do the same. This unconscious mimicry is driven by mirror neurons, specialized cells in your brain that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing it. These neurons create a kind of internal simulation, allowing you to understand others by experiencing a shadow version of their movements and emotions. This system is fundamental to empathy, the ability to feel what another person might be feeling by resonating with their state. When you see someone stub their toe, you might wince, not because you felt physical pain, but because your mirror neurons activated the same regions of your brain that process pain. This mirroring extends to emotions as well. Spend time with anxious people, and you may find yourself feeling uneasy without knowing why. Surround yourself with laughter and joy, and your mood lifts almost automatically. The phenomenon is so powerful that researchers can predict relationship dynamics by measuring how much two people unconsciously synchronize their gestures, posture, and speech patterns. Couples who mirror each other tend to report greater satisfaction and connection. Strangers who naturally fall into sync during a conversation are more likely to trust each other and form bonds. This is not manipulation or conscious strategy. It is the brain's ancient wiring for social connection, a system that binds us together through subtle, invisible threads of shared movement and feeling. Yet, this same system can be hijacked. Skilled salespeople and negotiators instinctively mirror their targets, creating a false sense of rapport that lowers defenses. We like people who are like us, and mirroring creates that illusion of similarity, even when deeper differences exist. Awareness of this tendency doesn't eliminate it. Even when you know you're being mirrored, the effect persists, a testament to how deeply these patterns are embedded in the architecture of the social brain. The halo effect colors your judgments. When you meet someone attractive, you're more likely to assume they're also intelligent, kind, and competent, even without evidence. This cognitive shortcut is called the halo effect, where one positive trait casts a glow over all other attributes. It works in reverse too. If someone seems unkempt or speaks with an unfamiliar accent, you might unconsciously assume they're less capable or trustworthy. This bias shapes everything from hiring decisions to courtroom verdicts. Studies show that attractive defendants receive lighter sentences on average, and job candidates who are taller or more conventionally good-looking are offered higher starting salaries. The halo effect even influences how we perceive products. A beautifully designed package can make food taste better, not because the contents changed, but because our brains conflate aesthetic appeal with quality. The roots of this bias lie in efficiency. Your brain is constantly making rapid assessments based on limited information, trying to predict who will help or harm you, which opportunities to pursue, which threats to avoid. Using visible cues as proxies for hidden qualities saves time and mental energy. In ancestral environments, these shortcuts were often accurate enough. A healthy, symmetrical face might have signaled good genes and disease resistance. But in modern, complex societies, the halo effect leads us astray more often than not. Success in a corporate environment has little to do with physical appearance, yet the bias persists. We judge books by their covers, candidates by their handshakes, ideas by the confidence with which they're presented. Awareness helps, but only partially. Even when you consciously remind yourself to evaluate people and situations based on objective criteria, the halo effect continues to operate beneath awareness, subtly tilting your perceptions and decisions in directions you might not endorse if you could see them clearly. Cognitive biases are features, not bugs. You might think that a rational brain would process information objectively, weighing evidence carefully before reaching conclusions. But human cognition is riddled with systematic biases, predictable patterns of error that seem to undermine rational thought. You favor information that confirms your existing beliefs and dismiss evidence that contradicts them. You overestimate your own abilities and the likelihood of positive outcomes while downplaying risks. You anchor too heavily on the first piece of information you receive and judge probabilities based on how easily examples come to mind, rather than actual statistical frequency. These tendencies, known collectively as cognitive biases, have been documented in hundreds of studies over the past 50 years. Yet calling them errors may be misleading. Many biases evolved because they conferred advantages. Confirmation bias, for instance, helps you maintain stable beliefs and social alliances. Constantly changing your mind in response to every new piece of information would be exhausting and socially costly. Overconfidence bias motivates you to take risks and pursue goals that rational calculation might deem too uncertain. Our ancestors who hesitated too long were outcompeted by those who acted boldly, even if those actions sometimes failed. The availability heuristic, judging likelihood based on memorable examples, works well when your memory accurately reflects the statistical distribution of events in your environment. If you remember many snake encounters, it's probably because snakes were genuinely common and dangerous where you lived. The problem arises when these ancient shortcuts are applied to modern contexts. You overestimate the danger of plane crashes because they're dramatic and heavily reported, while underestimating the risk of car accidents, which are statistically far more common but less memorable. You cling to false beliefs because your social group reinforces them, even when evidence clearly points elsewhere. These biases don't make you irrational, they make you human, equipped with a brain that evolved not for abstract truth, but for survival and reproduction in small social groups where quick, good-enough decisions often mattered more than perfect accuracy. Your attention is more selective than you think. Right now, as you listen to these words, countless stimuli surround you. The texture of the surface beneath you, the temperature of the air, the subtle sounds in the distance, the pressure of your clothing, the rhythm of your breathing. Yet most of this information never reaches your conscious awareness, because your brain filters relentlessly, highlighting what matters and suppressing the rest. This selectivity is so powerful that you can look directly at something and fail to see it if your attention is focused elsewhere. In a famous experiment, Participants were asked to watch a video of people passing basketballs and count the number of passes made by one team. Midway through the video, a person in a gorilla suit walked through the scene, paused to beat its chest, then exited. Roughly half of all viewers never noticed the gorilla. They were looking right at it, but because their attention was occupied with counting passes, the unexpected stimulus was filtered out. This phenomenon, called inattentional blindness, reveals just how narrow the spotlight of consciousness really is. Your brain cannot process everything, so it makes constant decisions about what to prioritize based on goals, expectations, and emotional relevance. This is why you can hear your name spoken across a crowded room, even when you weren't consciously listening. Your brain monitors the environment for personally significant information and elevates it to awareness when detected. The flip side is that much of life passes unnoticed. You miss subtle changes in your surroundings, fail to register the expressions on strangers' faces, and overlook opportunities that weren't on your mental radar. This selective attention is adaptive, allowing you to focus deeply on tasks without being overwhelmed by irrelevant details. But it also means your experience of the world is a curated highlight reel, not an objective recording of reality. Social norms shape behavior more than personal values. You probably like to think of yourself as an independent thinker, someone whose actions reflect deeply held principles rather than social pressure. But research consistently shows that humans are exquisitely sensitive to social norms, the unwritten rules that govern behavior in groups. These norms influence everything, from how close you stand to a stranger, to how much you tip at a restaurant, to whether you litter in public. In one classic study, researchers placed a single piece of litter in a parking garage and observed how it affected others' behavior. When the environment was otherwise clean, very few people littered. But when multiple pieces of trash were visible, littering rates skyrocketed. People inferred from the environment that littering was acceptable and adjusted their behavior accordingly. This sensitivity to norms is deeply rooted. Humans are social creatures who have always depended on group cooperation for survival. Being ostracized in ancestral environments often meant death, so we evolved powerful instincts to conform, to fit in, to avoid standing out in ways that might invite rejection. Even when the stakes are low, the urge to match the behavior of those around you operates automatically. This is why you might applaud at a performance, didn't enjoy if everyone else is clapping, or why you dress differently when visiting a new culture, or why your political opinions tend to align with those of your closest friends. Norms are so powerful that they can override personal morality. People will administer what they believe are painful electric shocks to strangers if an authority figure insists it's necessary, as Stanley Milgram's famous experiments demonstrated. They will conform to group judgments even when those judgments contradict obvious sensory evidence, as Solomon Asch showed when participants agreed with a group's clearly wrong answers about the length of lines. These findings don't mean people are weak or unprincipled. They reveal that the brain treats social acceptance as a fundamental need, one that often outweighs abstract commitments to truth or fairness. Understanding this can be unsettling, but it also offers a path toward change. If norms are powerful, shifting them can transform behavior on a large scale, more effectively than trying to change individual attitudes one person at a time. Stress narrows your focus. When you're calm, your mind wanders freely, making unexpected connections, noticing peripheral details, and considering multiple possibilities. But introduce stress, whether from a looming deadline, a financial worry, or an argument with a loved one, and your cognition changes dramatically. Your focus narrows, zeroing in on the immediate problem while filtering out everything else. This tunnel vision is driven by the body's stress response, a cascade of hormones, including cortisol and adrenaline, that prepare you for action. In the short term, this can be helpful. If you're facing a genuine threat, you don't want to be distracted by irrelevant thoughts. You need to focus all your mental resources on survival, whether that means fighting, fleeing, or freezing. The problem is that your brain can't always distinguish between a physical threat and a modern stressor, like an overdue bill or a difficult email. It responds to both with the same ancient circuitry, sharpening your focus, but also limiting your ability to think creatively or consider long-term consequences. Chronic stress compounds the problem. When cortisol remains elevated for extended periods, it begins to damage the hippocampus, impairing memory formation and making it harder to regulate emotions. You become more reactive, more prone to snap judgments, and less able to see the big picture. This is why stressed people often make poor decisions, fixating on immediate relief even when it creates larger problems down the road. They're not being irrational. Their brains are operating in a mode optimized for short-term survival, not long-term planning. The narrowing of focus also explains why stress undermines empathy. When you're overwhelmed, you have fewer cognitive resources to spare for understanding others' perspectives. The world shrinks to your own needs and fears, making it harder to connect with or care for those around you. Breaking this cycle requires more than willpower. It demands changes in environment, habits, and social support that reduce the chronic activation of stress systems and allow the brain to return to a more open, flexible state. You construct your memories every time you recall them. Memory feels like replaying a video, retrieving an accurate recording of past events stored somewhere in your brain. But that's not how it works. Every time you remember something, you're reconstructing it from fragments, bits of sensory detail, emotional tone, and contextual information that your brain weaves together into a coherent narrative. This process is prone to distortion. Each time you recall a memory, you slightly alter it, influenced by your current mood, new information, and subtle suggestions from the environment. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus demonstrated this with a series of elegant experiments. She showed participants videos of car accidents and then asked questions like, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Versus, how fast were they going when they hit each other? The word smashed led participants to estimate higher speeds, and in follow-up questions, to falsely remember seeing broken glass that wasn't present in the video. A single word changed their memory. This malleability extends to more significant events. People have been convinced, through gentle suggestion and repeated questioning, that they experience things that never happened, from getting lost in a shopping mall as a child to encountering animals that weren't there. These aren't deliberate lies. The individuals genuinely believe the false memories because their brains have constructed them using the same processes that create real memories. There's no reliable way to distinguish a true memory from a false one based on how vivid or confident it feels. Some of the most confidently held memories are entirely fabricated. This reconstructive nature of memory has profound implications. Eyewitness testimony, long considered highly reliable in courtrooms, is actually quite fallible. Witnesses can be unwittingly influenced by leading questions, suggestive lineups, and media coverage. The stories we tell ourselves about our past are equally unreliable. You might remember your childhood as idyllic or traumatic, but those narratives are shaped as much by your current psychological needs as by what actually happened. This doesn't mean the past is unknowable, only that memory is less like a recording and more like an ongoing process of storytelling, where truth and fiction blend in ways we cannot fully control or detect. Scarcity changes how you think. When resources are limited, whether time, money, or food, your mind shifts into a different mode. You become more focused on the scarce resource, better at managing it in the short term, but also more prone to tunneling, a form of cognitive narrowing that makes it harder to notice other important factors or plan for the future. Researchers studying this phenomenon found that poor individuals perform worse on cognitive tests, not because they're less intelligent, but because worrying about money consumes mental bandwidth. When the same individuals were tested after receiving financial relief, their cognitive performance improved dramatically. Scarcity creates a tax on attention. Your brain is so busy juggling immediate demands that it has fewer resources left for complex reasoning, self-control, and long-term planning. This helps explain why poverty is so difficult to escape. It's not just a lack of resources, it's the cognitive burden of constantly managing scarcity, which undermines the very capacities needed to improve one's situation. The same effect appears in other domains. When you're short on time, you become hyper-focused on deadlines, often neglecting relationships, health, and other important areas that don't scream for immediate attention. When you're on a diet, the scarcity of calories makes you think about food constantly, which can paradoxically make it harder to stick to your eating plan. Scarcity captures the mind, creating a feedback loop where the experience of lacking something makes it harder to manage that lack effectively. Understanding this can foster compassion. People struggling with scarcity are not failing due to moral weakness or poor character. They're operating under cognitive constraints that would affect anyone in similar circumstances. Addressing scarcity requires more than exhortations to make better choices. It requires structural changes that reduce the burden on attention and create slack, the breathing room that allows people to think beyond the immediate crisis and build toward a more stable future. First impressions form in milliseconds. When you meet someone new, your brain makes rapid judgments about their trustworthiness, competence, warmth, and status within a fraction of a second. These snap assessments, formed long before any conversation begins, are based on subtle cues like facial structure, posture, tone of voice, and eye contact. Research shows that people can predict with surprising accuracy, from just a brief exposure to someone's face, how others will judge that person on various traits. What's remarkable is how persistent these first impressions are. Even when you receive information that contradicts your initial assessment, you tend to interpret it in ways that preserve your original judgment. If you decided someone was untrustworthy within the first moments of meeting them, you'll scrutinize their behavior for signs of dishonesty and overlook evidence of integrity. This confirmation bias means that first impressions often become self-fulfilling prophecies. The person you judged negatively may sense your distrust and respond defensively, reinforcing your initial belief. The evolutionary logic is clear. In ancestral environments, quickly assessing whether a stranger was friend or foe could mean survival. There was no time for extended deliberation. Better to make a fast decision, even if sometimes wrong, than to hesitate and risk danger. This rapid judgment system remains active today, even though most social encounters don't carry life or death stakes. The result is that superficial characteristics, many of which have little to do with actual character, exert outsized influence on social and professional outcomes. People who happen to have facial features associated with trustworthiness or competence enjoy advantages in hiring, elections, and courtrooms, regardless of their actual abilities. Those whose appearance triggers negative snap judgments face uphill battles to overcome those biases. Awareness of this tendency doesn't eliminate it, but it can motivate you to slow down, gather more information, and consciously revise initial judgments when evidence warrants. The goal isn't to suppress first impressions, which may be impossible, but to hold them lightly, treating them as provisional hypotheses rather than fixed truths. Group dynamics change individual behavior. When you're alone, you might act according to your personal values and preferences, but place yourself in a group and something shifts. You become more influenced by what others think, more willing to go along with decisions you privately disagree with, and more likely to diffuse responsibility when action is needed. This is not weakness. It's the brain's evolved response to the social environment. One well-documented phenomenon is social loafing, the tendency to exert less effort when working as part of a group compared to working alone. In studies where people pull on a rope or clap their hands, individuals produce less force and make less noise in groups than when measured solo. The effort doesn't scale linearly with the number of people, because each person unconsciously relies on others to pick up the slack. This diffusion of responsibility also explains the bystander effect. When an emergency occurs in the presence of many witnesses, each individual is less likely to intervene, assuming someone else will take action. The more bystanders present, the less personal responsibility any one person feels. Tragically, this means victims are sometimes more likely to receive help when fewer people are around. Groups also amplify existing tendencies through processes like groupthink, where the desire for harmony and consensus overrides critical evaluation of ideas. Members suppress doubts, ignore warning signs, and converge on decisions that seem reasonable within the group, but would appear flawed to an outside observer. This dynamic has contributed to catastrophic failures in business, government, and medicine. Yet groups can also bring out the best in individuals. When norms emphasize cooperation and mutual support, people rise to meet those expectations. When leaders model accountability and reward dissenting opinions, groups make better decisions than any individual could alone. The key is understanding that group membership activates different parts of your psychology. You're not simply yourself in a crowd. You're a version of yourself shaped by social dynamics, for better or worse. And recognizing this allows for more intentional cultivation of group cultures that promote, rather than undermine, individual virtues. Habits form through repetition, not time. You've probably heard that it takes 21 days to form a habit, or maybe 66 days, depending on which self-help article you read. But the truth is more nuanced. Habits form through repetition and consistency, not the passage of time alone. A behavior becomes habitual when it's repeated enough times in a consistent context that it becomes automatic, triggered by environmental cues rather than conscious decision-making. The brain encodes these patterns in the basal ganglia, a region involved in procedural learning. Over time, the neural pathway linking cue to behavior strengthens, requiring less and less cognitive effort to execute. This is why you can drive a familiar route while lost in thought, or brush your teeth without consciously directing each movement. The behavior has been offloaded to automatic systems. The length of time this takes varies dramatically, depending on the complexity of the behavior and individual differences. Simple actions like drinking a glass of water after waking can become habitual within weeks. More complex routines involving multiple steps and decisions may take months or never fully automatize. What matters more than duration is the consistency of the context and the reward structure. Behaviors followed by positive outcomes are more likely to stick, as the brain learns to associate the cue-behavior pairing with a favorable result. This is why it's easier to maintain a habit when it's genuinely enjoyable or immediately beneficial. The challenge is that many valuable habits, like exercising or saving money, offer delayed rewards. The brain's reward systems are biased toward immediate gratification, so sustaining these behaviors requires either external accountability or deliberate cultivation of proximate rewards, finding ways to make the activity itself pleasurable rather than relying solely on distant outcomes. Breaking a habit is harder than forming one because the neural pathways don't disappear. They're simply suppressed by alternative behaviors. This is why former smokers can feel cravings decades after quitting when exposed to strong cues like the smell of cigarettes. The habit pathway is still there, dormant, but reactivatable. Successful behavior change often requires not just willpower, but environmental redesign, removing cues that trigger unwanted behaviors and introducing cues that prompt desired ones. Loss aversion shapes decisions. Imagine you're offered a gamble. Flip a coin. Heads, you win $100. Tails, you lose $50. Statistically, this is a favorable bet with an expected value of $25. Yet most people refuse it. The pain of losing $50 feels roughly twice as intense as the pleasure of gaining $100. This asymmetry, known as loss aversion, is one of the most robust findings in behavioral economics. Losses loom larger than equivalent gains. The brain processes them differently, with potential losses activating threat-related regions more strongly than potential gains activate reward centers. This bias evolved because, in survival contexts, avoiding harm was often more critical than seeking reward. An ancestor who passed up a chance to gather extra food might miss a meal, but one who failed to avoid a predator might not survive to reproduce. Natural selection favored those who were more cautious about losses. In modern contexts, loss aversion leads to conservative behavior that can be costly. People hold on to losing investments too long, hoping to break even rather than cutting losses and reallocating resources. They avoid career changes, even when current situations are clearly suboptimal, because the certainty of giving up what they have feels worse than the possibility of gaining something better. They purchase expensive insurance for minor risks, overpaying for the psychological comfort of avoiding potential losses. Marketers exploit this bias routinely. Framing a discount as avoiding a loss rather than gaining a benefit, don't miss out versus save money, can significantly increase sales. Politicians use it too, emphasizing what citizens stand to lose under an opponent's policies, rather than what they might gain under their own. Loss aversion also fuels the endowment effect, the tendency to value things more highly once you own them. A coffee mug you possess feels more valuable than an identical mug you might acquire, not because ownership changes the object's properties, but because giving it up registers as a loss. This makes negotiations and trades more difficult than they need to be, as both parties overvalue what they have and undervalue what they might receive. Overcoming loss aversion requires reframing, consciously focusing on the opportunity costs of inaction and the potential gains from change. But the bias persists even when intellectually recognized, a quiet voice always whispering that holding on is safer than letting go. Empathy is not universal. You might assume that empathy, the ability to sense and share another person's emotions, is an automatic response that applies equally to everyone. But research reveals that empathy is selective. You're more likely to feel empathy for people who are similar to you, members of your in-group, whether defined by race, nationality, political affiliation, or even arbitrary categories created in laboratory experiments. When researchers divide people into groups based on trivial criteria, like preferring one type of abstract painting over another, participants quickly develop in-group favoritism, allocating more resources to their group and feeling more empathy for its members' suffering. This selectivity makes evolutionary sense. In small ancestral groups, cooperation and mutual support within the group enhance survival, while competing groups often pose threats. Empathy for in-group members facilitated cohesion and altruism, while empathy for outsiders was less adaptive and potentially risky. Modern brains retain this bias, even though we now live in large, diverse societies where tribalism often does more harm than good. Studies using brain imaging show that observing in-group members in pain activates empathy-related regions more strongly than observing out-group members. In some cases, seeing rivals experience pain can even activate reward centers, a disturbing phenomenon called schadenfreude. This doesn't mean people are inherently cruel, but it reveals how deeply social identity shapes emotional responses. The boundaries of your empathy can be expanded, but it requires effort. Exposure to diverse perspectives, especially narratives that humanize members of outgroups, can gradually shift who you feel connected to and care about. Yet even well-intentioned people carry empathy gaps. You might intellectually support policies that help distant strangers, while feeling far more distress over a friend's minor inconvenience. This imbalance influences everything from charitable giving to policy preferences to everyday interactions. Recognizing that empathy is not a universal reflex, but a socially mediated response, can motivate more deliberate cultivation of compassion, a broader form of concern that doesn't depend on feeling another's pain, but simply recognizes their humanity and worth. Sleep deprivation impairs judgment. When you're exhausted, you know you're not at your best, but you probably underestimate how severely lack of sleep undermines cognitive function. Even moderate sleep deprivation, missing just an hour or two a night over several days, impairs attention, memory, and decision-making in ways comparable to intoxication. After being awake for 24 hours straight, your cognitive performance mirrors that of someone legally drunk. Yet, unlike alcohol, which you can feel impairing you, sleep loss often creates an illusion of competence. You feel foggy and tired, but you don't realize how much your judgment has deteriorated. This is especially dangerous in high-stakes situations. Doctors working long shifts make more medical errors. Judges deliver harsher sentences late in the day, after many hours of decision-making. Drivers who are drowsy cause thousands of accidents annually, often because they don't recognize how impaired they are until it's too late. The brain's prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functions like planning, impulse control, and weighing consequences, is particularly vulnerable to sleep loss. When this region is compromised, you become more reactive, more likely to choose immediate rewards over long-term benefits, and less able to regulate emotions. You might snap at a colleague over a minor annoyance or indulge in behaviors you'd normally resist, not because your values changed, but because the neural machinery for self-control is offline. Sleep is also critical for memory consolidation. Experiences from the day are processed and integrated into long-term memory during sleep, particularly during the deep stages of non-REM sleep and the vivid dreaming of REM sleep. Without adequate rest, new information fails to stick. Students who stay up all night cramming retain less than those who study and then sleep, even if the total study time is shorter. The brain doesn't just need rest, it needs sleep, specifically to clear metabolic waste, strengthen synaptic connections that matter, and prune those that don't. Chronic sleep deprivation accumulates as a debt that can't be easily repaid with a single long night of rest. It contributes to long-term health problems, including obesity, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive decline. In a culture that often valorizes busyness and equates sleep with laziness, recognizing that rest is foundational to performance, creativity, and well-being is not indulgence. It's necessity. Context shapes perception. Imagine you're listening to a piece of music. Alone in a quiet room, you might find it soothing. But play the same music in a suspenseful movie scene, and it becomes ominous. The notes haven't changed, but your perception has, shaped by context. This principle extends far beyond music. The meaning you extract from any stimulus depends on the surrounding environment, your expectations, and your current emotional state. A famous experiment illustrated this with wine tasting. When participants believed they were drinking expensive wine, they rated it as more enjoyable and activated brain regions associated with pleasure more strongly than when they thought the same wine was cheap. The sensory experience was identical, but the contextual information about price altered both subjective enjoyment and objective neural responses. Similarly, pain feels worse when you don't know when it will end, and time seems to pass more slowly when you're bored or anxious. Context doesn't just influence trivial preferences. It can determine whether you perceive a situation as threatening or benign, whether you interpret an ambiguous comment as friendly or hostile, whether you notice opportunities or overlook them. Two people can witness the same event and walk away with completely different interpretations because they brought different contexts with them, different past experiences, beliefs, and emotional states. This susceptibility to context is both a strength and a vulnerability. It allows for flexibility, the ability to adapt interpretations to fit new situations and extract different meanings from the same information. But it also makes you manipulable. Marketers, politicians, and anyone else trying to influence behavior understand that framing, the way information is presented, can be more important than the information itself. The same policy can be made to seem generous or stingy, risky or safe, fair or unjust, simply by changing the context in which it's described. Being aware of how profoundly context shapes perception doesn't eliminate its influence, but it can make you more skeptical of your immediate reactions and more curious about how changing the frame might change your understanding. What seems obvious in one light might look entirely different from another angle, and the truth, if it exists, is often somewhere in the interplay of perspectives. People overestimate their own knowledge. If you've ever felt confident explaining something, only to stumble when pressed for details, you've experienced the illusion of explanatory depth. People consistently overestimate how well they understand how things work, from everyday objects like toilets and zippers to complex systems like economies and ecosystems. Psychologists demonstrated this by asking participants to rate their understanding of various mechanisms, then asking them to explain step by step how those mechanisms function. After struggling through incomplete and inaccurate explanations, participants revise their confidence downward, often dramatically. This illusion arises because knowledge feels accessible. You know that toilets flush and zippers zip. That shallow familiarity is mistaken for deep understanding. Your brain conflates knowing that something works with knowing how it works. This confusion is compounded by the fact that you're surrounded by expertise. You can look things up, ask questions, rely on others' knowledge. The division of cognitive labor means you don't need to know everything yourself, so you rarely confront the limits of your understanding. This becomes problematic when overconfidence leads to poor decisions. You might support complex policies without understanding their mechanisms, or attempt repairs you're unqualified to perform, or dismiss expert opinion because you feel you grasp the basics. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes a related phenomenon where people with low competence in a domain overestimate their ability because they lack the very knowledge needed to recognize their own ignorance. Conversely, experts often underestimate their relative skill because they're more aware of what they don't know and assume others share their knowledge. The antidote is intellectual humility, recognizing that confidence is not a reliable indicator of accuracy, that the feeling of understanding is often illusory, and that seeking out information and perspectives that challenge your assumptions is not a sign of weakness, but a mark of wisdom. This doesn't mean constant self-doubt. It means holding beliefs with appropriate tentativeness, being willing to update them when evidence warrants, and approaching disagreements with curiosity rather than defensiveness. Facial expressions are not universal. For decades, psychologists believed that basic emotions like happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust were expressed through universal facial expressions, recognizable across all cultures. This idea, popularized by Paul Ekman, suggested that emotions were hardwired into the human brain with fixed expression patterns. But more recent research challenges this view. Studies conducted with diverse populations, including remote cultures with little exposure to Western media, show much more variability in how emotions are expressed and interpreted than the universality theory predicted. Facial expressions are influenced by cultural norms, context, and individual differences. What reads as a polite smile in one culture might seem insincere in another. Anger might be expressed through subtle changes in posture and gaze, rather than overt facial tension. Even within a culture, individuals vary widely in how expressively they display emotions. Some people have animated faces that telegraph every feeling. Others maintain neutral expressions regardless of their internal state. This doesn't mean facial expressions are arbitrary. There are patterns and regularities, especially for basic emotional states under certain conditions. But the relationship between internal feeling and external expression is far more complex and culturally mediated than early theories suggested. This has profound implications for cross-cultural communication. Misreading someone's expression can lead to misunderstandings and conflict. Assuming that your intuitive reading of faces is accurate can blind you to the real emotions others are experiencing. It also complicates the development of technologies like facial recognition for emotion detection, which often rely on Western norms and perform poorly when applied to diverse populations. Understanding that facial expressions are not a simple, universal window into the soul requires more effortful interpretation, more willingness to ask and listen, rather than assuming you can read people accurately at a glance. It's another reminder that what feels natural and obvious is often shaped by specific cultural learning, and that empathy requires not just feeling with others, but also learning the particular ways they express and communicate their inner lives. Choice can be paralyzing. You might assume that having more options is always better, that freedom and satisfaction increase with the number of choices available. But psychological research reveals a paradox. Beyond a certain point, more choices lead to less satisfaction, more anxiety, and greater likelihood of decision paralysis. In one famous study, shoppers at a grocery store were offered samples of jam. One display featured 6 varieties, another featured 24. More people stopped to sample from the larger display, but they were far less likely to make a purchase. The abundance of options overwhelmed decision-making, leading to paralysis and regret. When we do choose from a large set, we're more likely to second-guess the decision, wondering if another option would have been better. This is partly because every choice involves trade-offs. Selecting one jam means foregoing 23 others, and your mind fixates on what you're giving up rather than what you're gaining. The more options you consider, the more acutely aware you become of opportunity costs. This effect is compounded in consequential decisions like choosing a career path, a romantic partner, or a place to live. The modern world offers unprecedented freedom, but that freedom can feel burdensome when every path not taken looms as a potential mistake. This doesn't mean choice is bad. Autonomy and self-determination are fundamental to well-being. But there's a sweet spot. Enough choice to avoid feeling constrained, but not so much that decision-making becomes agonizing. Simplifying choices, setting satisficing rather than maximizing goals. That is, aiming for good enough rather than the absolute best, and deliberately limiting the options you consider can reduce anxiety and increase satisfaction. Ironically, constraints can be liberating. When some decisions are made for you, or when you set boundaries on what you'll consider, the remaining choices become more manageable, and you're more likely to feel content with the outcome rather than haunted by roads not traveled. The anchoring effect skews judgments. When you're asked to estimate a value, whether the price of a house, the population of a city, or the likelihood of an event, your answer is influenced by any number mentioned recently, even if it's completely irrelevant. This is the anchoring effect. Experimenters demonstrated it by having participants spin a wheel that landed randomly on a number between 0 and 100. Then asking them to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations. Those who spun higher numbers gave higher estimates, even though they knew the wheel was random and unrelated to the question. The initial number served as an anchor, subtly pulling their estimates in its direction. This bias operates constantly in everyday life. Real estate agents list properties at specific prices, not just to maximize profit, but to anchor buyers' perceptions of value. Negotiations begin with opening offers that set the range within which subsequent discussions will occur, even when those offers are arbitrary. Retailers display expensive items next to moderately priced ones to make the latter seem more affordable by comparison. Your brain uses the anchor as a starting point and adjusts from there. But the adjustment is usually insufficient, leaving your final estimate biased toward the initial value. This happens even when you're aware of the effect and try to correct for it. The mechanism is partly automatic, operating below conscious awareness. One reason anchoring is so persistent is that it conserves cognitive effort. Making estimates from scratch is hard. Using available information, even irrelevant information, as a reference point simplifies the task. The brain asks, is the true value higher or lower than this number, and makes a quick adjustment rather than engaging in effortful calculation. To counteract anchoring, you can deliberately consider extreme alternatives or generate your own independent estimate before encountering any suggested values. But even these strategies offer only partial protection. The best defense is awareness combined with healthy skepticism about your initial impressions, especially when they align suspiciously well with numbers you've recently encountered. Music synchronizes groups. When people sing together, dance together, or even just clap in unison, something remarkable happens. Their movements synchronize, their heart rates begin to align, and their sense of social bonding strengthens. This phenomenon, called synchrony, is a powerful tool for creating cohesion in groups. It's why military drills involve marching in formation, why religious ceremonies feature collective singing and chanting, why sports fans chant in unison. The act of moving together literally brings people together psychologically. Research shows that children who participate in synchronized activities, like group drumming, are more cooperative and helpful toward one another afterward. Adults who walk in step with someone are more likely to trust them and work collaboratively on subsequent tasks. The effect is not subtle. Even brief episodes of synchrony can enhance feelings of connection and reduce barriers between strangers. The mechanism likely involves mirror neurons and other neural systems for action observation and imitation. When you move in rhythm with others, your brain simulates their actions, creating a kind of blurred boundary between self and other. This dissolution of separateness, even temporarily, fosters empathy and reduces in-group versus out-group distinctions. Music is particularly effective because it naturally invites synchrony. A good beat compels you to tap your foot or nod your head. When everyone in a room does this together, the collective rhythm creates a shared psychological state. This is why concerts and dance clubs can feel transcendent, not just because of the music itself, but because of the synchronized experience with others. Historically, music and dance were central to community rituals, serving to strengthen social bonds and coordinate group action. Modern societies retain these practices in modified forms, from national anthems to wedding dances. The emotional pull of these activities is not accidental or superficial. It's rooted in deep evolutionary mechanisms that bind individuals into cohesive groups capable of acting as one. Gratitude has measurable benefits. When you take time to reflect on things you're grateful for, you're not just engaging in a feel-good exercise. You're triggering measurable changes in your brain and body. Studies show that people who regularly practice gratitude experience higher levels of positive emotions, greater life satisfaction, and improved physical health. They sleep better, exercise more, and report fewer symptoms of illness. Gratitude interventions, like writing letters of thanks or keeping a gratitude journal, have been tested in randomized controlled trials and consistently produce benefits for mental well-being. The effects are not just correlational. Gratitude appears to cause improvements, not simply reflect an already positive disposition. One mechanism is attentional. Gratitude shifts your focus from what's lacking to what's present. This doesn't mean ignoring real problems or adopting a Pollyanna attitude. It means balancing awareness of difficulties with recognition of resources, relationships, and small pleasures that often go unnoticed. By directing attention toward positive aspects of life, gratitude counters the brain's natural negativity bias, the tendency to fixate on threats and losses. Neuroimaging studies show that feeling grateful activates brain regions associated with reward and social bonding, including areas rich in dopamine and oxytocin receptors. Over time, regular gratitude practice may strengthen these neural pathways, making it easier to access positive emotions and maintain perspective during challenges. Gratitude also has social benefits. Expressing appreciation strengthens relationships. People who feel thanked are more motivated to help again and to help others. Gratitude creates upward spirals of generosity and cooperation. Yet, like many psychological interventions, gratitude can feel forced or inauthentic if approached mechanically. Simply listing things you're supposed to be grateful for without genuine feeling may produce little benefit. The key is to engage emotionally, to savor and linger on the positive aspects, rather than rushing through a checklist. This requires slowing down, creating space for reflection, and allowing yourself to feel the warmth of appreciation without immediately moving on to the next task or worry. You can only maintain a limited number of close relationships. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed that the human brain can sustain approximately 150 meaningful social relationships. This number, known as Dunbar's number, is based on the size of the neocortex relative to overall brain size and correlates with typical group sizes observed in hunter-gatherer societies and modern social networks. Beyond 150, relationships become too shallow to maintain as genuine, reciprocal connections. The number breaks down into layers. You have about 5 intimates, people you could turn to in a crisis. Then around 15 close friends, 50 good friends, and 150 acquaintances you interact with somewhat regularly. Beyond that, you might recognize faces and names, but you don't truly know these people or maintain active relationships with them. This limit is not arbitrary. It reflects the cognitive capacity required to track individuals' personalities, histories, and social networks, to remember who said what to whom, and to navigate the complex web of alliances and obligations that characterize human groups. Maintaining relationships requires time and mental effort. Each friendship demands communication, shared experiences, and emotional investment. As social circles expand, the resources available to each relationship shrink. This constraint has implications for modern life. Social media platforms allow you to accumulate hundreds or thousands of connections. But these connections are often superficial. You might feel you have a vast network, but when in need, you'll likely turn to the same small circle of intimates. The illusion of connectivity can even undermine deeper relationships by spreading your limited social energy thin. Understanding this limit can help you prioritize. Rather than trying to maintain an unsustainable number of friendships or feeling inadequate because you can't keep up with everyone, you can focus on deepening the relationships that matter most. Quality over quantity is not just a platitude. It's a recognition of cognitive and emotional constraints. Human brains evolved for small groups where everyone knew everyone else. Modern life tests those limits, and thriving socially may require consciously curating your network to fit the architecture of your mind. The present feels more real than the future. When faced with a choice between a reward now and a larger reward later, you often choose the immediate option, even when the delayed option is objectively better. This preference for immediacy is called temporal discounting or present bias. $1 today feels more valuable than $1 next week, even though rationally they're equivalent. The effect is strongest for short delays and diminishes as delays lengthen. You might prefer $10 today over $12 tomorrow, but you'd probably prefer $12 in a year over $10 in a year minus 1 day. The future you is a different person in your mind, someone whose interests don't weigh as heavily as your current selves. This bias has profound effects on behavior. It explains why people struggle with saving for retirement, procrastinate on important tasks, and indulge in pleasures that carry long-term costs. The immediate gratification of eating dessert outweighs the distant abstract goal of losing weight. The relief of putting off an unpleasant task overshadows the future stress of a looming deadline. The brain's reward systems are wired to respond most strongly to immediate outcomes, because in ancestral environments, the future was uncertain. There was no guarantee you'd survive long enough to enjoy a delayed reward. So evolution favored those who seized opportunities when they arose. Modern life, however, demands long-term planning. Success often depends on sacrificing present comfort for future gains. But your brain hasn't caught up. You intellectually know you should save, exercise, and prepare, but in the moment, those distant benefits feel abstract compared to the vivid reality of now. Combating present bias requires strategies that bring the future closer. Vividly imagining future consequences, setting up automatic systems that remove the need for in-the-moment willpower, and creating immediate rewards for long-term oriented behaviors can help. But the fundamental tension remains. You're trying to act in the interest of a future self you don't viscerally care about as much as your present self, using a brain designed for environments where the future was always uncertain. Silence can be uncomfortable. In conversation, gaps of more than a few seconds often feel awkward. You rush to fill them with words, even when you have nothing important to say, because silence signals something is wrong. This discomfort with silence is culturally variable. Some cultures tolerate longer pauses than others, but it appears to be widespread. The roots may lie in the social function of talk. Speech is a primary way humans build and maintain relationships. Silence can be interpreted as disengagement or hostility. In tense situations, the absence of communication escalates suspicion and anxiety. Yet silence also has power. Pausing before responding signals thoughtfulness. Silence during conflict can prevent escalation, giving emotions time to cool. In therapeutic contexts, silence allows clients to process feelings without the therapist's words crowding their thoughts. Silence in nature or meditation can be restorative, providing a break from the constant stimulation of modern life. The discomfort arises when silence is unexpected or when its meaning is ambiguous. If you're not sure whether the other person is thinking, displeased, or waiting for you to speak, the uncertainty creates tension. Once the meaning is clear, perhaps you're both simply enjoying a quiet moment together. The discomfort evaporates. Learning to tolerate silence, to resist the compulsion to fill every gap, can improve communication. It allows for deeper reflection, signals confidence, and creates space for others to speak. But it requires overcoming an instinct that equates silence with social failure, a challenging shift in a culture that often valorizes constant talk and stimulation. Your mood affects your memories. When you're happy, you're more likely to recall happy memories. When you're sad, sad memories come to the fore. This phenomenon, called mood-congruent memory, creates a feedback loop. If you wake up feeling low, your mind naturally drifts toward past disappointments and failures, which deepens the low mood, which in turn makes it even easier to access negative memories. The cycle can spiral, trapping you in a pattern where the past seems uniformly bleak, even though it wasn't. The mechanism involves state-dependent learning. Memories are encoded not just as isolated facts, as experiences bundled with the emotional context in which they formed. When your current emotional state matches the state you were in during encoding, retrieval becomes easier. This is why revisiting a place you associate with a particular person or time can flood you with memories you hadn't thought about in years. The emotional atmosphere serves as a key that unlocks stored experiences. This has therapeutic implications. Cognitive behavioral therapy works partly by helping people access and reframe negative memories when they're in a more balanced emotional state, breaking the mood-congruent cycle. It also explains why depression is so self-reinforcing. The illness doesn't just make you feel bad, it reshapes your autobiography, making your entire life story seem darker than it actually was. Conversely, positive moods broaden thinking and make the past seem richer and more hopeful. This isn't delusional. It's the brain's way of maintaining emotional coherence. You construct a past that makes sense given how you feel now. The challenge is recognizing that your current mood is coloring your perception, and that the story your memory tells today might be very different from the one it told yesterday or will tell tomorrow. Memory is not a stable archive. It's a dynamic process influenced by the emotional weather of the present moment. Rituals reduce anxiety. Across cultures and throughout history, humans have engaged in rituals, repetitive behaviors performed with symbolic significance. From religious ceremonies to personal superstitions, rituals seem to serve a psychological function beyond their stated purpose. Research shows that engaging in rituals, even arbitrary ones, created in laboratory settings, reduces anxiety and increases feelings of control. In one study, participants who performed a ritual before a stressful task, like public speaking, reported feeling calmer and performed better than those who didn't. The content of the ritual mattered less than the act of performing it. Whether you knocked on wood, repeated a phrase, or followed a specific sequence of movements, the repetition and structure provided psychological benefits. Why do rituals work? One explanation is that they impose order on chaos. When the world feels unpredictable or threatening, rituals create pockets of predictability. The actions are within your control, even if outcomes aren't. And this sense of agency, however illusory, soothes the nervous system. Rituals also serve as transitional markers, helping your brain shift from one mode to another. Athletes have pre-game rituals that signal the transition from everyday life to performance mode. Bedtime rituals help signal the shift from wakefulness to sleep. These behavioral cues train your body and mind to respond in specific ways, creating consistency in environments that might otherwise feel chaotic. Shared rituals strengthen social bonds. Weddings, funerals, and holidays bring people together in collective action, reinforcing group identity and providing comfort through communal structure. Even small personal rituals, like always having coffee in the same mug or taking the same route on a morning walk, offer reassurance. They anchor you in routine when everything else feels turbulent. The power of ritual is not in magic or supernatural intervention. It's in the psychological structure it provides, the way it organizes time, space, and attention in ways that make life feel more manageable and meaningful. Stories shape identity. Your sense of who you are is not a collection of objective facts, but a narrative you tell yourself and others about your life. This narrative identity weaves together past experiences, present circumstances, and future aspirations into a coherent story with themes, turning points, and character development. The story changes over time as you reinterpret the past in light of new experiences and shifting values. An event that once seemed like a failure might be recast as a valuable lesson. A relationship that defined you at one point might fade into background detail as other connections take center stage. Psychologists find that people who construct redemptive narratives, stories in which adversity is overcome and suffering leads to growth, tend to report higher well-being and life satisfaction. This isn't because their lives were objectively better, but because the story they tell makes their experiences meaningful. Conversely, people who frame their lives as contamination narratives, where good things are spoiled, or where they're perpetual victims of circumstance, often struggle more, even when their objective circumstances are similar. The narrative you construct doesn't just reflect your identity, it shapes it. By emphasizing certain memories and downplaying others, by interpreting events in particular ways, you create a self-concept that guides future behavior. If your story is one of resilience, you're more likely to face challenges with determination. If it's a story of helplessness, you may avoid risks and opportunities. This means identity is somewhat within your control. You can't change what happened to you, but you can change the story you tell about it. Narrative therapy works on this principle, helping people author new versions of their lives that are more empowering and aligned with their values. This isn't about denial or fabrication. It's about recognizing that multiple true stories can be told about any life, and the one you choose to emphasize has real consequences for your psychological well-being and future trajectory. Touch is a fundamental need. Human beings require physical touch for healthy development and emotional well-being. Infants who are deprived of touch, even when their other needs are met, fail to thrive. They show delayed physical growth, cognitive impairments, and emotional disturbances. This was tragically demonstrated in orphanages where babies received minimal handling. Despite being fed, kept clean, many became withdrawn and developmentally delayed. The introduction of more touch and physical affection dramatically improved outcomes. Touch remains important throughout life. It reduces stress hormones, lowers blood pressure, and boosts immune function. A hug from a trusted person can calm your nervous system more effectively than words. Massage therapy has measurable benefits for both physical and mental health, reducing pain, anxiety, and depression. Even brief casual touch, like a pat on the shoulder or a handshake, can increase feelings of connection and trust. The skin is rich with nerve endings that send signals to the brain's emotional centers. Touch activates the release of oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, which promotes feelings of security and attachment. This is why physical affection strengthens relationships. Couples who regularly engage in non-sexual touch, holding hands, cuddling, report higher relationship satisfaction. Parents who are physically affectionate with children foster secure attachment and emotional regulation. Yet modern life often involves touch deprivation. Many people, especially those who live alone or are socially isolated, go days without meaningful physical contact. This deprivation has consequences, contributing to feelings of loneliness and disconnection. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted this need when physical distancing measures left people starved for touch. The absence of hugs, handshakes, and casual contact took a psychological toll that was difficult to articulate but deeply felt. Recognizing touch as a fundamental human need, not a luxury or optional extra, is important for individual and collective well-being. Finding appropriate ways to incorporate more touch into daily life, whether through pets, massage, or physical activities that involve contact, can address an often overlooked aspect of health. Uncertainty triggers discomfort. Your brain is a prediction machine, constantly generating expectations about what will happen next based on past experience. When predictions are confirmed, you feel at ease. When outcomes deviate from expectations, especially in unpredictable ways, you experience discomfort. This intolerance of uncertainty is adaptive to a point. It motivates you to gather information and make plans to reduce ambiguity. But when taken to extremes, it becomes a source of chronic anxiety. Some people find uncertainty so distressing that they avoid situations where outcomes are unclear, passing up opportunities because they cannot be guaranteed. Or they engage in compulsive behaviors aimed at creating certainty where none exists. Worry itself is often an attempt to manage uncertainty by mentally rehearsing possible scenarios, even though this rarely provides useful preparation and often amplifies anxiety. The problem is that life is inherently uncertain. You cannot predict or control most of what happens to you. Health, relationships, careers, all involve elements of chance. Clinging to an illusion of certainty requires either avoiding life or engaging in magical thinking. The alternative is learning to tolerate uncertainty, to sit with the discomfort of not knowing without needing to resolve it immediately. This is easier said than done because the brain resists. It wants answers, even bad ones, over the tension of ambiguity. Research shows that people often prefer negative certainty over uncertainty. They'd rather know for sure that something bad will happen than remain in suspense about whether it might. The known feels safer than the unknown, even when the known is unpleasant. Developing tolerance for uncertainty involves exposure, deliberately putting yourself in situations where outcomes are unclear, and learning that you can handle the discomfort. It also involves shifting focus from outcomes to process, finding meaning and engagement in the present, rather than pinning your well-being to future events you cannot control. Mindfulness practices help by training attention to stay with present moment experience, rather than projecting into an uncertain future. Over time, you can learn to see uncertainty not as a threat to be eliminated, but as an inherent feature of existence to be accepted, even embraced, as the space where possibility lives. Power changes behavior. When people gain power, whether through a promotion, election, or social dynamics, their behavior often changes in predictable ways. They become more confident, more willing to take risks, and more focused on their own goals. They also become less empathetic, less attentive to others' perspectives, and more prone to acting on impulses without considering consequences. Studies show that people in positions of power interrupt more, listen less, and are less accurate at reading others' emotions. They're more likely to stereotype and objectify those with less power, seeing them as means to ends rather than as full human beings. This is sometimes called the paradox of power. The very qualities that help people attain power, such as empathy, collaboration, and attentiveness to others, tend to erode once power is achieved. The mechanism involves disinhibition. Power reduces the social and personal constraints that normally regulate behavior. When you don't depend on others' approval or fear consequences, your impulse control weakens. You act more on whims, say what you're thinking without filtering, and take what you want without considering fairness. This can lead to ethical lapses and abuses. History is full of leaders who started with good intentions, but became tyrannical as power insulated them from feedback and accountability. The effect is not inevitable. Some people maintain empathy and integrity in positions of power, often those who deliberately practice perspective-taking and surround themselves with people who will challenge them. Self-awareness helps, but the pressures are strong. Power changes not just how others treat you, how you see yourself and the world. It can feel like you've earned the right to special treatment, that rules apply differently to you, that your judgment is superior. These beliefs are self-serving distortions, but they feel true when you're in the grip of them. Organizations can mitigate these effects through structural accountability, ensuring that no one is above oversight and that power is distributed rather than concentrated. But the psychological tendency remains. Power, like any intoxicant, alters consciousness in ways that the person experiencing it often cannot see clearly. Nostalgia serves a function. Nostalgia, the bittersweet longing for the past, was once considered a disorder, a pathological inability to let go. But contemporary research reveals it as a normal and even beneficial psychological process. When you feel nostalgic, you're not just passively remembering, you're actively constructing a version of the past that serves present emotional needs. Nostalgia tends to be triggered by negative states, loneliness, sadness, or meaninglessness. In response, your mind retrieves memories, often from adolescence and early adulthood, that are imbued with warmth, connection, and significance. These memories rarely represent the past accurately. They're selective, emphasizing positive aspects and downplaying the difficulties. But this selective reconstruction is the point. Nostalgia provides psychological comfort. It reminds you that you've experienced joy and belonging before, which suggests you can again. It connects you to a continuous sense of self, a narrative thread linking your past to your present. Studies show that after inducing nostalgia in laboratory settings, people report feeling more optimistic, more socially connected, and more certain that their lives have meaning. The effect is not just subjective. Nostalgia can motivate pro-social behavior and increase resilience in the face of stress. It buffers against existential anxiety, reminding you that you're part of a larger story. However, nostalgia can become problematic if it turns into idealization of the past at the expense of engaging with the present. If you constantly look backward, longing for a time that cannot return, you may miss opportunities to create new, meaningful experiences. The key is balance, using nostalgia as a resource to draw on when needed, without letting it dominate your emotional life. Appreciating the past without being trapped by it allows nostalgia to serve its adaptive function, a source of comfort and continuity that helps you navigate the challenges of the present while remaining oriented toward the future. You judge yourself differently than others. When explaining your own behavior, you tend to emphasize situational factors. I snapped at my colleague because I was stressed and hadn't slept well. But when explaining someone else's identical behavior, you're more likely to attribute it to their character. They snapped at me because they're rude and temperamental. This asymmetry is called the fundamental attribution error. You see your own actions as responses to circumstances, but you see others' actions as reflections of who they are. The bias exists because you have access to your own internal states, your fatigue, worries, and intentions, but you don't have direct access to others' minds. You observe their behavior without the contextual information that might explain it, so you default to assuming it reveals their personality. This leads to systematic misunderstandings. You extend charity to yourself while judging others harshly. You expect others to understand the pressures you're under, but fail to imagine the pressures they might be experiencing. The error works in reverse too. When you succeed, you attribute it to your abilities and effort. When you fail, you blame external factors. But when others succeed, you might downplay their accomplishment as luck or circumstance. And when they fail, you see it as evidence of inadequacy. These biases protect self-esteem, but at the cost of accuracy and empathy. Overcoming the fundamental attribution error requires deliberate perspective-taking. Before judging someone's behavior, pause and ask what situational factors might be at play. What pressures might they be under? What information might they lack? What goals might they be pursuing that you're unaware of? This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it humanizes others and opens space for understanding. Similarly, taking responsibility for your own actions, acknowledging that your character does play a role and that you can't always blame circumstances, fosters growth and accountability. The goal is not to eliminate self-compassion or empathy, but to apply them more evenly, seeing yourself and others with similar generosity and nuance. Pain is influenced by expectation. If you're told a medical procedure will be excruciating, you'll likely experience more pain than if you're told it will be mildly uncomfortable, even if the physical stimulus is identical. Expectation shapes sensory experience, and nowhere is this more evident than in pain perception. The brain doesn't passively receive pain signals. It actively interprets them based on context, past experience, and what you believe will happen. This is why placebos work. If you believe a sugar pill is a powerful painkiller, your brain releases endogenous opioids, chemicals that genuinely reduce pain, making the placebo effective despite having no pharmacological action. The effect is not imaginary. Brain imaging shows that placebo treatments reduce activity in pain-processing regions, just as real medications do. The mind, in this sense, creates the experience of pain and can also relieve it. Conversely, nocebo effects occur when negative expectations increase pain. If you're warned about severe side effects, you're more likely to experience them, even from inert substances. The anticipation itself activates neural pathways, amplify discomfort. This has profound implications for medical practice. The way doctors communicate with patients about pain and treatment can directly influence outcomes. Empathetic, reassuring communication can reduce pain, while dismissive or frightening language can intensify it. Pain is also influenced by attention. Focusing on a painful sensation makes it worse, while distraction can provide genuine relief. This is why soldiers injured in battle sometimes report feeling little pain until after the danger has passed. Their attention was occupied by survival, and the brain down-regulated pain signals accordingly. Mindfulness approaches to pain management work by changing your relationship to pain rather than eliminating the sensation. By observing pain without resistance or catastrophizing, you can reduce the suffering component, the emotional and cognitive layers that typically amplify the raw sensory input. Pain is real, but it's also constructed by the brain in ways that make it more modifiable than we often assume. You adapt to both good and bad circumstances. When something wonderful happens, a promotion, a new relationship, a long-awaited purchase, you feel elated. But this joy doesn't last as long as you expect. Within weeks or months, your happiness returns to baseline. This process, called hedonic adaptation, also works for negative events. After initial distress, you gradually adjust to loss, disappointment, and even serious adversity. Your mood stabilizes, and life feels normal again, even in circumstances that once seemed unbearable. This adaptation is both blessing and curse. It's a blessing because it means you're resilient. You can endure hardships without permanent emotional devastation. But it's a curse because it means pleasure and achievement provide less lasting satisfaction than anticipated. You work for years toward a goal, imagining how fulfilled you'll feel upon reaching it, only to find that the glow fades quickly, and you're soon pursuing the next goal with the same unfulfilled longing. The mechanism involves shifting reference points. Your brain recalibrates what it considers normal based on current circumstances. A salary that once seemed generous eventually feels inadequate as you adjust your lifestyle and compare yourself to higher earners. A relationship that began with intense passion settles into comfortable routine, and you forget how lonely you once felt. This recalibration is automatic and difficult to prevent. However, some things resist adaptation more than others. Experiences tend to provide more lasting satisfaction than material possessions because they cannot be fully adapted to. A memory of a meaningful trip or conversation remains vivid, while a new car becomes just transportation. Activities that require ongoing engagement, like learning a skill or building relationships, continue to provide satisfaction because they evolve rather than remaining static. Understanding hedonic adaptation can help you make better decisions. If you're considering a major change, recognize that both the highs and lows will be more temporary than they feel in imagination. This doesn't mean nothing matters. It means sustained well-being comes from sources that resist adaptation, such as purpose, growth, connection, and contribution, rather than from achievements or acquisitions that your brain will quickly take for granted. Belonging is a core human need. Humans are profoundly social creatures. Your ancestors survived not through individual strength, but through cooperation and group membership. Being part of a tribe meant access to resources, protection from threats, and support during hardship. Exclusion meant vulnerability and often death. Natural selection favored those who cared deeply about social acceptance and who experienced rejection as painful. Today, your brain still treats social connection as a survival imperative. Neuroimaging studies show that social rejection activates the same brain regions involved in physical pain. Being excluded from a group, even a group of strangers in a laboratory experiment, triggers genuine distress. Chronic loneliness is associated with increased inflammation, weakened immune function, and higher mortality risk. The effects are comparable to smoking or obesity. Belonging isn't just pleasant, it's a biological necessity. Yet modern life makes belonging harder. Geographic mobility separates people from extended family and childhood friends. Digital communication provides an illusion of connection, while often leaving people feeling more isolated. Communities that once provided automatic belonging, neighborhoods, churches, civic organizations, have weakened. Many people report having no close friends, no one they could call in a crisis. This loneliness epidemic has profound consequences for mental and physical health. The good news is that belonging can be cultivated. It requires time, vulnerability, and consistent effort. You have to show up repeatedly, take social risks, and invest in relationships even when it feels awkward or inconvenient. Shared activities, especially those involving cooperation or collective meaning-making, foster bonds more reliably than casual socializing. The quality of connection matters more than quantity. A few deep relationships provide more psychological benefit than many superficial ones. Belonging doesn't mean constant togetherness or universal approval. It means knowing there are people who see you, care about you, and would support you if needed. It's the sense that you matter to someone beyond yourself, that your absence would be noticed and mourned. This fundamental need, ancient and unrelenting, shapes much of human behavior, driving the pursuit of acceptance, the fear of rejection, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you belong. Attention is a limited resource. Your ability to focus is not infinite. Like a muscle, it can be exhausted through use and requires rest too. Recover. Every decision you make, every task you complete, every temptation you resist, draws from a shared pool of mental energy. When this resource depletes, you experience decision fatigue. Your choices become less rational, defaulting to the easiest or most familiar option rather than the best one. You become more impulsive, less able to delay gratification, and more prone to errors. Research with judges found that they were more likely to grant parole to defendants early in the day or immediately after breaks, when mental resources were fresh. As the day wore on and fatigue set in, they defaulted to the safer, easier decision: denial. The implications extend beyond courtrooms. After a long day of work, you're more likely to eat poorly, skip exercise, or snap at loved ones. Not because you don't care, but because self-regulation is depleted. The modern environment exacerbates this. Constant connectivity means you're bombarded with notifications, messages, and choices that drain attention. Multitasking, switching rapidly between tasks, is especially taxing because each shift requires reorienting and inhibiting the previous focus. By the end of the day, you've spent your cognitive budget on trivialities, leaving little for what truly matters. Protecting attention requires setting boundaries, limiting distractions, creating environments that support focus, and building routines that reduce the number of decisions needed all help conserve mental energy. Scheduling important work when you're fresh, typically early in the day for most people, increases the likelihood of success. Rest and recovery are equally important. Sleep restores cognitive function, but so do breaks throughout the day. Brief periods of unfocused rest, walking, daydreaming, allow the brain to replenish its resources. Recognizing attention as finite and precious shifts how you approach daily life. You can't do everything, focus on everything, or be available to everyone. Choices must be made, and making them consciously, rather than letting the environment dictate where your attention goes, is essential for sustained effectiveness and well-being. Comparison undermines happiness. When you evaluate your life, you don't do so in isolation. You compare yourself to others, friends, colleagues, strangers on social media, and this comparison profoundly shapes your satisfaction. If you earn a comfortable income but your neighbors earn more, you feel less satisfied than if you earned less in absolute terms, but more than those around you. Happiness, it turns out, is relative. This was true even in pre-industrial societies, where people compared themselves to immediate community members. But modern life amplifies the problem. Social media presents curated highlights of others' lives, success, beauty, adventure, without the struggles and mundane moments. You compare your internal experience, full of doubt and difficulty, to others' polished exteriors, leading to the distorted conclusion that everyone else has it better. Studies consistently find that heavy social media use correlates with lower life satisfaction and higher rates of depression and anxiety. The mechanism is comparison. You feel inadequate, not because your life is objectively bad, but because it seems worse than everyone else's. This is exacerbated by the availability of global comparisons. Previous generations compared themselves to local peers. Now you compare yourself to billions, including celebrities and the most successful people in your field. It's impossible to win this game. No matter how much you achieve, someone has achieved more. The hedonic treadmill keeps you running. Escaping the comparison trap requires deliberate effort. Limiting social media exposure helps, as does cultivating gratitude for what you have rather than fixating on what you lack. Focusing on personal growth, comparing your present self to your past self rather than to others, provides a more meaningful metric of progress. Recognizing that others' displays are selective and often misleading can also help. Everyone struggles. Everyone experiences failure and pain. The glossy images are not the full story. Finally, pursuing intrinsic goals, those aligned with your values and interests, rather than extrinsic goals aimed at impressing others or meeting societal expectations, tends to produce more lasting satisfaction because the rewards are internal and don't depend on winning a competition you can never truly win. Names matter. When you hear your own name, your brain responds differently than to other words. Attention sharpens. You orient toward the sound. This effect, called the cocktail party phenomenon, allows you to pick out your name from a noisy background, even when you weren't consciously listening. Names are deeply tied to identity. Hearing your name spoken, especially by someone you care about, creates a sense of recognition and connection. Using someone's name in conversation, not excessively but naturally, strengthens rapport. It signals that you see them as an individual, not an interchangeable person. Research in negotiations and sales shows that people respond more favorably when their name is used, though overuse can seem manipulative. The power of names extends beyond interpersonal dynamics. Companies with easy-to-pronounce names are judged more favorably, and stocks with simpler ticker symbols perform better in initial trading. Not because of underlying value differences, but because fluency, the ease with which something is processed, is associated with positive feelings. Names also carry meaning that subtly influences perceptions. Studies find that people with common, easy-to-pronounce names are rated as more likable and trustworthy than those with unusual or complex names. Teachers expect less from students with names that sound lower class, affecting the attention and encouragement those students receive. Job applicants with names associated with minority groups receive fewer callbacks, even when qualifications are identical. These biases are often unconscious, operating beneath awareness, but their effects are real and cumulative. Your own name shapes your self-concept. People tend to prefer letters in their name and are drawn to careers, places, and even romantic partners whose names share initials or sounds with their own. This narcissistic bias, called the name-letter effect, influences major life decisions in subtle ways. None of this means names determine destiny, but they are more than arbitrary labels. They're part of the social and psychological fabric that shapes how you're perceived and how you perceive yourself. Small but significant threads in the tapestry of identity. You underestimate how much you'll change. If asked to predict who you'll be in 10 years, you probably imagine someone fairly similar to your current self. Your preferences, values, and personality might mature slightly, but you expect fundamental continuity. Yet, when you look back 10 years, you're struck by how much you've changed. Your tastes are different. Your priorities have shifted. The person you were seems almost like a stranger. This asymmetry, called the end of history illusion, reflects a consistent bias. People recognize how much they've changed in the past, but underestimate how much they'll change in the future. They believe that who they are now is essentially who they'll always be, even though their own history contradicts this. The bias has practical consequences. You make decisions assuming your future self will want the same things you want now. You get a tattoo, convinced you'll love it forever. You commit to a career path, assuming your interests won't shift. You invest in possessions or relationships based on who you are today, without accounting for the person you'll become. Sometimes these bets pay off. Often they don't. 10 years later, you're burdened by commitments that no longer fit, wondering why you were so certain they would. Why does this bias exist? One reason is that change happens gradually. Day to day you feel stable. Change accumulates imperceptibly until you look back across years and see the distance traveled. The future feels abstract and uncertain in ways that the past, crystallized into memory, does not. Your current self is vivid and immediate. Your future self is a hazy projection, difficult to imagine concretely. Accepting that you will change can inform better decisions. Instead of locking yourself into inflexible commitments, you can maintain optionality, leaving room for evolution. Rather than clinging to a fixed self-concept, you can embrace growth and transformation as natural and inevitable. This doesn't mean abandoning all stability. Core values and relationships can provide continuity even as specifics shift. But recognizing that the person you are today is not the final version, that you're still becoming, allows for greater flexibility and less regret when the future arrives and you find yourself different than you expected. Culture shapes perception. You like to think you perceive the world objectively, that what you see is what's there. But culture profoundly influences not just what you think, but how you see. Research comparing people from Western and East Asian cultures reveals systematic differences in visual perception. When shown a picture, Westerners tend to focus on central objects, the focal figure in a scene. East Asians distribute attention more evenly, noticing background and context as well. This difference extends to how people think. Western cultures emphasize individualism, personal agency, and analytical reasoning that breaks systems into components. East Asian cultures emphasize collectivism, interdependence, and holistic reasoning that considers relationships and context. These are not just abstract values. They shape cognition at a fundamental level. Westerners are more likely to commit the fundamental attribution error, attributing behavior to personality rather than situation. East Asians are more sensitive to context and situational influences. In logical reasoning tasks, Westerners are more comfortable with contradiction and binary thinking, true or false. East Asians are more accepting of paradox and dialectical reasoning, recognizing that opposites can coexist. Even basic perceptual tasks show cultural variation. The famous Muller-Lyer illusion, where two lines of identical length appear different due to arrowheads pointing in or out, is stronger in people raised in environments with many right angles, typical of Western architecture. People from cultures with round dwellings show weaker susceptibility. Experience shapes how the brain processes visual information. Language also structures thought. Languages that grammatically encode gender lead speakers to associate objects with masculine or feminine characteristics. Languages that lack future tense markers, where saying, "it rains tomorrow" and "it rains now" use the same verb form, correlate with higher savings rates. Speakers of those languages perceive the future as closer and more continuous with the present, making long-term planning feel more immediate. These findings challenge the notion of universal human cognition. While brains are biologically similar, the software culture provides, shapes perception, thought, and behavior in profound ways. Understanding this helps you recognize the limitations of your own perspective, seeing it as one possibility among many, rather than the only way to perceive and interpret reality. Stress is contagious. When you spend time with someone who's anxious or stressed, you often absorb those emotions without realizing it. Your heart rate increases, cortisol rises, your own mood shifts toward anxiety. This phenomenon, called emotional contagion, happens automatically through subtle mimicry of facial expressions, body language, and tone of voice. Your mirror neuron system picks up on others' emotional states and reproduces them internally, allowing you to resonate with what they're feeling. This is the basis of empathy, but it's also a vulnerability. Chronic exposure to stressed individuals can dysregulate your own stress response, leading to burnout, even if your direct workload is manageable. Healthcare workers, teachers, and caregivers are particularly susceptible, absorbing the distress of those they serve. The effect extends beyond one-on-one interactions. Group mood is a real phenomenon. When a team is positive and energized, individual members feel more motivated. When collective morale is low, even optimistic individuals struggle to maintain enthusiasm. Leaders set the emotional tone, and their stress or confidence ripples through the organization. Awareness of emotional contagion suggests the importance of managing not just your own emotional state, but the emotional environment you create for others. If you're in a position of influence, your stress affects those around you. Conversely, you can deliberately cultivate positive emotions, calm, humor, confidence, that spread to others and create an upward spiral. Protecting yourself from negative contagion involves boundaries. You can't always avoid stressed people, but you can limit exposure when possible, create recovery time after emotionally taxing interactions, and develop practices that restore your baseline. Grounding techniques, physical activity, and spending time with calm, positive people all help counteract absorbed stress. Recognizing that emotions travel between people like viruses makes you more intentional about both what you emit and what you allow yourself to absorb. Authority is easier to obey than resist. In the 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted experiments that revealed disturbing truths about human nature. He recruited participants to deliver what they believed were painful electric shocks to another person, actually an actor, whenever that person answered a question incorrectly. The shocks started mild, but escalated to levels labeled as dangerous. Many participants were visibly distressed, questioning whether they should continue. Yet, when the experimenter, wearing a lab coat and speaking with authority, calmly instructed them to proceed, the majority did. They delivered shocks all the way to the maximum voltage, despite hearing screams of pain, because an authority figure told them to. The study demonstrated that ordinary people will commit acts that violate their own moral standards when directed by someone they perceive as legitimate authority. This isn't because they're evil. It's because social structures and evolutionary psychology create powerful pressures to obey. In hierarchical groups, which characterized most of human history, following leaders increased survival. Disobedience brought punishment or exclusion. Modern brains retain this wiring. When someone in a position of authority issues a command, questioning them feels uncomfortable and risky, even when the command is unethical. This has profound implications. It explains how ordinary individuals participate in atrocities when embedded in systems that normalize harmful actions. It shows why whistleblowers are rare. Standing up to authority requires overcoming deep psychological resistance. It also explains everyday compliance with unreasonable demands from bosses, doctors, or officials. You might know a directive is wrong, but feel paralyzed to resist. Combating blind obedience requires cultivating moral courage and critical thinking, questioning not just what you're told, but who has the right to tell you. It requires systems of accountability that limit concentrated authority and encourage dissent. It requires recognizing that obeying an unethical order, even under pressure, is still a choice, and you bear responsibility for that choice. Milgram's experiments are controversial and ethically problematic by modern standards, but the findings remain chilling and relevant. They remind us that the capacity for harm doesn't require malice. It only requires obedience. Boredom serves a purpose. Boredom is universally disliked, but it's not a design flaw. It's an evolved signal that your current activity isn't providing sufficient stimulation, reward, or meaning. Boredom motivates you to disengage and seek something more worthwhile. In environments where opportunities were abundant and varied, boredom pushed ancestors to explore, innovate, and avoid stagnation. The problem arises when you can't escape boring circumstances, or when you try to eliminate boredom entirely. Modern life offers endless entertainment, but constant stimulation numbs your capacity for engagement. When you're always consuming content, scrolling, watching, listening, you don't develop the tolerance for unstructured time that creativity and reflection require. Boredom becomes intolerable, something to be avoided at all costs. Yet, research suggests that periods of boredom can enhance creativity. When your mind isn't occupied, it wanders, making unexpected connections and generating novel ideas. Some of the best insights come not from focused effort, but from idle moments when the brain is free to roam. Boredom also provides contrast that makes stimulating activities more rewarding. If you're never bored, nothing feels particularly engaging. Learning to tolerate boredom without immediately reaching for a distraction is a valuable skill. It allows deeper focus when you do engage with meaningful tasks and fosters patience, a quality increasingly rare in a culture of instant gratification. This doesn't mean seeking out boredom deliberately or valorizing tedium, but it means recognizing that not every moment needs to be filled, that emptiness and restlessness are part of the human experience and can be productive if you don't reflexively medicate them with distraction. Sometimes, the most interesting things emerge when you allow yourself to be bored. Kindness benefits the giver. Acts of kindness don't just help recipients, they also boost the well-being of the person performing them. Studies show that spending money on others produces more lasting happiness than spending it on yourself. Volunteering is associated with improved mental health and even longer life expectancy. Small acts, holding a door, offering a compliment, listening attentively, generate positive emotions that linger. The mechanism involves multiple pathways. Helping others activates reward circuits in the brain, releasing dopamine and creating a mild euphoria, sometimes called the helper's high. It also fosters social connection, reminding you that you're part of a community where people support one another. Kindness enhances self-image. When you act generously, you see yourself as a good person, which reinforces your identity and values. This creates an upward spiral. Feeling good leads to more kindness, which leads to feeling better. Yet modern life often inhibits kindness. You're busy, stressed, preoccupied with your own concerns. The stranger on the train, the overwhelmed cashier, the colleague struggling with a project, these are invisible or ignored. Social media amplifies outrage and division, making kindness seem naive or weak. Cynicism becomes a protective shell. Reclaiming kindness requires intentionality. It means noticing opportunities to help, even in small ways, and taking them. It means assuming good intentions in others, rather than defaulting to suspicion. It means recognizing that generosity is not zero-sum. Helping someone else doesn't deplete you. It often does the opposite, filling you with a sense of purpose and connection. This isn't to suggest that kindness should be motivated by self-interest. The point is that doing good and feeling good are intertwined. Altruism isn't sacrifice. It's a path to fulfillment that enriches both giver and receiver. Time perception is malleable. Have you noticed how time seems to slow down during a crisis, but speeds up during routine? Your perception of time is not fixed. It varies based on attention, emotion, and novelty. When you're fully engaged in something challenging, hours can pass in what feels like minutes. This is called flow, a state where action and awareness merge. Conversely, when you're bored or waiting, minutes stretch unbearably. Time also feels different in memory. A week filled with new experiences seems longer in retrospect than a week of routine, even if both felt equally long while happening. This is because memory is event-based. The more distinct memories you create, the more time seems to have passed. As you age, time seems to accelerate, partly because life becomes more routine. Childhood is full of firsts, school, friendships, discoveries, creating dense, novel memories. Adulthood often settles into patterns where weeks blur together. Fewer new memories make time feel like it's rushing by. You can slow the subjective passage of time by seeking novelty, learning new skills, visiting new places, breaking routines. These experiences create distinct memories that expand your sense of duration. Attention also shapes time. When you're distracted or multitasking, you're not fully encoding experience, and time slips away unmemorable. Mindfulness, the practice of paying close attention to present moment experience, can make time feel richer and more expansive. Emotion alters time as well. Fear and excitement stretch moments. During an accident, people report time slowing down as their brains process information more rapidly. Positive emotions can also dilate time, making a joyful moment feel suspended and luminous. Understanding time perception helps you curate experiences. If you want life to feel longer and richer, prioritize novelty and presence. If you need time to pass quickly, routine and distraction will oblige. Time is not just something that happens to you. It's something your brain constructs, and that construction is influenced by how you live. You have less free will than you think, but enough. The question of free will has occupied philosophers for centuries. Neuroscience adds a twist. As mentioned earlier, your brain commits to actions before you're consciously aware of deciding. Genetics, early experiences, and situational factors constrain your choices in ways you don't control. Yet, saying you have no free will feels wrong. You deliberate, weigh options, and feel responsible for your actions. The resolution may lie in compatibilism, the view that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. You don't have the kind of free will that assumes you could have chosen otherwise in an absolute sense, holding everything constant. But you do have agency within constraints. Your choices are influenced, not dictated. You can reflect on your desires, question them, and sometimes override them. This reflective capacity is what matters for moral responsibility and personal growth. If you were simply a passive observer of behavior driven entirely by unconscious forces, there'd be no point in deliberation, therapy, or education. But these interventions work because they shape the processes that generate choices. You can cultivate habits, values, and thought patterns that steer you toward better decisions. Understanding that behavior arises from complex interactions of biology, environment, and history fosters compassion. When someone acts badly, it's not just moral failing, it's the output of systems they didn't fully choose. This doesn't eliminate accountability. Actions have consequences, and society must respond. But it tempers judgment with humility. Recognizing limits on your own free will can also reduce arrogance. Your successes reflect not just effort, but luck, the luck of genetics, upbringing, opportunities. This recognition can foster gratitude and generosity rather than entitlement. The question isn't whether you have absolute free will. You don't. The question is whether you have enough to make choices that matter, to grow, to take responsibility, and to shape the trajectory of your life within the constraints you've been given. And the answer, imperfect and bounded as it is, appears to be yes. And now, as your thoughts grow quiet and your breathing deepens, let's bring this journey to a gentle close. We've wandered through the invisible architecture of human behavior, from the way your brain decides before you know it, to the emotions that etch memories deeper than facts. From the mirror neurons that bind you to others, to the biases that shape every judgment, every moment. You are not as rational as you'd like to believe, nor as conscious of your motivations as you feel. But you are also more resilient than you know, more capable of change than you imagine, and more deeply connected to those around you than the individualistic myths of modern culture suggest. Your behavior, strange and contradictory as it sometimes seems, is the product of millions of years of evolution, thousands of years of culture, and decades of personal history, all woven together in patterns you only partly control, but can still influence, shape, and direct toward meaning. You are a creature of habit and novelty, of reason and emotion, of connection and solitude. You are built for belonging, yet crave autonomy. You seek certainty, yet thrive in the unknown. These contradictions don't need resolving. They are what make you human, beautifully, frustratingly, endlessly human. As you rest now, know that your mind will continue its work, sorting through the day's experiences, consolidating memories, dreaming in symbols and narratives that weave the fragments into meaning. Trust that process. Trust that you are enough, even with all your biases and blind spots, your fears and your longing. You have done enough for today. The world will turn without your vigilance. Problems will wait for tomorrow's clearer thinking. For now, there is only this: the softness of the pillow, the rhythm of your breath, the quiet darkness behind closed eyes. Let go of the need to understand everything, to fix everything, to be everything. Let go of comparison and judgment. Let go of yesterday's mistakes and tomorrow's worries. Just be here, in this moment, which asks nothing of you except rest. Close your eyes, sink deeper into stillness. Let your body grow heavy, your thoughts drift away like clouds at dusk. You are safe. You are held by the quiet night. And somewhere in that darkness, between waking and dreaming, you'll find the peace you've been seeking all along. Good night. Sleep well. Dream softly.